30, published by Hart, in which legal scholars attempt to see where the current crisis of constitutionalism and its constructive and interconnected elements, from democracy to human rights to free international trade, can lead in the next decade if we don't counteract such development and refocus the debate to those issues. Yet closest to his heart, as far as I can tell, remains the concept of free speech. A multi-layered universe, as we will see from his lecture, which intriguing dimensions we are going to uncover today through the lecture. His task can be described simply. What is speech? But as we will see, the task is not simple at all. As Professor Bezemek tries to establish the necessary conditions for what counts as speech and consequently shall be protected by law. Dear Christoph, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, dear Thomas, for this far too flattering introduction. I would like to thank the Dean, not only for gracing this lecture with her presence, but also for her outstanding hospitality. And I would like to compliment all of you on this wonderful institution that brings together people from such diverse backgrounds and scholarly interests, and what makes this place truly special. I'm honored by your invitation, and I'm very happy to be here. As Thomas already indicated, what I intend to talk to you about today is what do we speak about when we speak about speech. I will start this lecture off by an exercise in, let's say, comparative religious studies. It's not really an accurate historical depiction, as you soon will find out, but it may prove to be useful for the case at hand. It is a story that has been told in many varieties over the last decades, and it basically goes as follows. Imagine Italy, or what we now refer to as Italy 500 years ago, during the period that the Europeans would refer to as Renaissance. Large parts of Italy by then have been dominated, what we would refer to as the Papal States. Nowadays, the Papal State is basically the Vatican City only, which has basically 1 square kilometer to its own. Back then, it was far larger than that. And so our story says, the Pope decreed 500 years ago, upon the threat of expulsion by force, that all Jews had either to convert to Catholicism or leave the Papal States. The Pope went to bed, having done his business, and in a dream, St. Thomas Aquinas appeared to him, one of the saints of the Catholic Church that is next to St. Augustine, particularly known as a teacher of the church and somebody who is considered in the Christian European tradition a great thinker in his own right. And upon that appearance of St. Thomas in the Pope's dream, the Pope had a change of heart, and he said, well, let's not drive out the Jews from the very outset. I will debate a leader of the Jewish community on religious matters, and if said leader of the Jewish community on religious matters can stand his ground in a debate with me, fine, I will allow the Jews to stay in the Papal State. So the Jewish community met, and they picked an old and wise rabbi to represent them in the debate. There was a problem, however, because the rabbi didn't speak any Latin, and the Pope didn't speak any Yiddish. And so both sides agreed that they would have a symbolic debate. And when the date of the great debate, as we may refer to it from now on, finally came, the rabbi and the Pope sat opposite each other at a large table that was set up in the Pantheon, one of the oldest churches in Rome that used to be a site of worship for the Romans already back then, when the Roman Empire was still something as a force in Europe. And the debate started as follows. The Pope raised his hands and waved it around his head. The rabbi, upon that, looked back at the Pope and pointed to the ground. The Pope then again, and rather insistently, raised one finger and kept showing it to the rabbi. Whereas the rabbi presented 3 fingers to the Pope. Thereupon, the Pope produced a piece of sacramental bread and a chalice of wine. And the rabbi pulled out an apple from his pocket. Upon having done that, the Pope declared himself defeated and said the Jews are allowed to stay in the Papal States. So what happened next? Later that day, the Pope met with the cardinals of the Curia, so very high representatives of the Catholic Church, and these high representatives asked the Pope, what has happened? And the Pope said, well, see, first I waved my hand around my head to emphasize that there is no salvation to be found outside our all-encompassing church. The rabbi responded by pointing to the ground, reminding me that still this earth and all its inhabitants are God's beloved creation. Then I raised my finger to emphasize that nonetheless, according to the first commandment, we were obliged to believe in but one God. The rabbi then raised 3 fingers, reminding me that it was after all us and not them who believed in the Holy Trinity. Then I produced wine and the host to show that the Holy Trinity was in part necessary to remind us that God sent down his Son to earth to die for the sins of mankind. Whereas the rabbi pulled out an apple from his pocket to remind me that this was just because mankind as a whole was united in your original sin. And so he counted my every move, and I was not able to go on. Meanwhile, at the same time, the Jewish community gathered around the rabbi and asked the rabbi how he'd won. The rabbi said, I have no idea. First, he told me that we would have to leave immediately. And I said, we prefer to stay. Then he said, you have 1 day. And I said, we need at least 3. And then a woman inquired, what happened next? Well, I don't know. He took out his lunch and I took out mine. So the great debate, as we may refer to it, evidently, as I indicated before, never took place. It is somewhat evident that this is a made-up story and a nice joke, maybe. What is not so evident is whether or not the great debate could qualify as a debate from the very outset. After all, it is far from clear that there is such a thing as a debate absent any verbal exchange, so people speaking properly to each other. Also, and this is not a negligible fact, the somewhat crude symbolism that was employed in this symbolic debate caused nothing but misunderstanding. So they basically didn't talk to each other. And that is only if the actions taken by the participants in the great debate would qualify as symbolic from the very outset, and that is far from sure. Ours is, of course, not the place to conduct a, let's say, linguistic assessment. It is the place, however, to ask how conduct, as we find it featured in the great debate, factors in our understanding of expression and what we would consider freedom of expression. Or, to put it more bluntly, as I indicated before, it is the place to ask, what do we speak about when we speak about speech? As we will see, or so I will argue at least, this requires some linguistic assessment time and again. In doing so, let us start by stating the obvious. William Rehnquist, the former Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, you may have come across him in your research and in your classes, he noted for the First Amendment to the United States Constitution that freedom of speech evidently means more than simply the right to talk and to write. And this, I think, in all fairness, applies to free speech clauses in general. And if we were to look at the case law of European courts, national high courts, ECJ, European Court of Human Rights alone, we would find so many examples what could qualify as more in this sense. Movies, works of art, photographs, caricatures, displaying trademarks, that may qualify as protected speech, just as a wide range of conduct, such as mere gestures, photo burning, panhandling, if you were to wear a badge, a flower, a veil, a uniform, if you were to hang dirty laundry, outside Parliament, if you were to throw a candle when the king crossed the street, if you were to scare away fish, if you were to fry your eggs over the eternal flame, if you were to hold a hunger strike, if you were organizing a blockade, a sit-in, if you were displaying a flag, if you were collecting signatures, if you were shouting tally-ho, if you were walking slowly on purpose, if you were pouring paint on a monument, if you were affixing a Santa Claus cap to a monument, if you were to remove pieces of ribbon from a wreath, or to give you the most absurd example from the jurisprudence of the European Court of Human Rights, if you were to use a restroom in public. That is distinctly not, ladies and gentlemen, using a public restroom. All that and a variety of other acts were judicially recognized in Europe as free speech. That is, speech within the scope of protection of a free speech clause, such as Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights. You may have come across it already. The obvious question that arises is, why? After all, any free speech clause that would be worth its salt certainly cannot serve as an all-encompassing safeguard that would cover any kind of human conduct. A right to free speech, as my friend Frederick Schauer emphasizes, does not contain a right to commit murder. It does not contain a right to drive a car in a pedestrian zone. It does not contain a right to sell heroin. Right. And that is obvious enough, I think. But then again, the question is, why? Focusing on the relevant case law, we see that the European Court on Human Rights would regularly emphasize that Article 10, so the free speech clause of the Convention, does not distinguish between the various forms of expression. Accordingly, so the court would tell us, all means of expression are included in the ambit of Article 10 of the Convention. Freedom of speech, as safeguarded by the European Convention on Human Rights, thus protects not only the substance of the ideas and information that are expressed, but also the form in which they are conveyed. And to make it short, I could talk about this for hours, but you don't want me to do that. That applies on the national level just as well. Even for those countries, this is important to emphasize, in which free speech clauses expressly deem only certain forms of expression protected. So, against that backdrop, European scholarship has long since perceived free speech as what we may refer to a comprehensive freedom of individual communication, much more than the freedom to talk, much more than the freedom to write, evidently. And yet this raises the question whether it does not achieve anything beyond simply, let's call it, substituting one term that is rather vague for another term that is just as vague. Because individual communication, that is a very broad class. It includes, in addition to many acts of speech and publication, as Thomas Scanlon would put it, the display of symbols, the failure to display them, demonstration, musical performances, and some bombings, maybe assassinations, and self-immolations. And while the list I presented to you before does include some of those items, such as the display of symbols, which is without a doubt protected, we may hesitate to grant free speech protection to bombings, to assassinations, and to self-immolation. The question is, and this is what I will try to answer, where do we draw the line? Let us start maybe by asking the question where not to draw it. In the US, there has been a dominant debate on this question that would separate pure speech from mere conduct, and this proved to be a dead end. After all, we have to accept that all communication is related to some course of conduct. Not only because verbal communication, the way that I speak to you at this very moment, is to a large extent shaped by extralinguistic elements. There are studies that go back to the 1970s that would explain, and rather convincingly so, that you would perceive what I'm saying now not by the mere words that I'm uttering, by the way that I'm gesturing also, just the way that I grimace in my face, by my mere presence and the way I conduct myself in general. But that is not everything we have to consider. We have also to consider, and this is a deep truth, even if it is, it sounds somewhat naive, that speaking, what I do at this very moment, is itself a bodily act. It is a bodily activity. So it is, speaking is conduct. But there is more. Because given that freedom of speech is not intended to protect verbal acts, but rather interpersonal communication, a strict distinction between pure speech and speech plus conduct can neither be consistently maintained, nor is it purposeful. Louis Henkin remarked a couple of decades ago, a constitutional distinction between speech and non-speech has no content. There is speech that is conduct, and there are actions that speak. And there is nothing, he would go on writing, we could consider intrinsically more sacred about wagging the tongue or wielding the pen. There is nothing intrinsically more sacred, and this is important, about words than other symbols. This brings us to an important point. All communication necessarily requires the use of symbols. Now, human language may be, of course, the most sophisticated of the uses of symbols that we can imagine, and the most highly developed. But it may qualify as nothing more against that backdrop as the normal type of the communication of ideas, as has been emphasized by scholarship in the past. This does not, in substance, necessarily distinguish this conduct from other conduct that has symbolic quality, or, to make it short, any conduct can be communicative in the aforementioned sense. This goes hand in hand with an assumption that we may refer to as the functional equivalence, so that basically the way they work turns out the same of, let's say, speech, facial expressions, gestures, and signs, and it goes hand in hand with some legal views that have been uttered to the contrary, that we could actually ask ourselves the question whether or not speech or conduct would dominate. This question turns out to be moot. However, if that is so, that there can be no presumption in favor of language, as what I referred to only 1.5 or 2.5 minutes ago, as the normal type of communication of ideas. There can be no presumption that verbal utterances are indeed intended to communicate with the help of other means, while in contrast we have to really look closely whether other conduct could be considered expressive. When we assess individual acts used for communication, there can be no automatism in favor of verbal utterances. There are, I don't know whether you ever came across them, there has been a school of poetry in the early 20th century that is self-referred to it as Dadaism. Yeah? Simply because it didn't make any sense, and it didn't want to make any sense. It was Dada, basically. Because it was Dada, the poets that engaged in Dada poetry, they would write mere sound poems. Hugo Ball was one of the major exponents of Dadaist poetry. And if you took the time, perhaps you're curious and spent 5 minutes, wouldn't need more in the afternoon, of looking up Hugo Ball's Caravan, you would find that whether or not something is said or expressed by said sound poem, that is highly dubious. At the same time, we could easily agree that a Shakespeare sonnet, for example, would qualify as what we would typically consider speech. But what if Thomas and I were to hike in the woods of Austria and we'd be very scared of let's say, wild boars that roam the woods. And in order to scare off the wild boars, and because Thomas and I were very intellectual guys, we know our Shakespeare sonnets by heart, we would start reciting Shakespeare sonnets, but only for the purpose of scaring off the wild boar. Is that something that would qualify as communication? And then on the other hand, some unfriendly gestures we can consider rather common in Central Europe when it comes to driving. They seem to be understood by themselves. Don't force me to present them to you. Your imagination will serve you well. You have this here in this region, I imagine, just the same. Well, on the one hand, this suggests already at this point that just as communication relevant to our purpose is not to be equated with human language is not necessarily to be considered communication. This has rather significant consequences for our present consideration. After all, speech as a mere form of human action is subject in exactly the same sense as is walking or lighting a fire or shooting a gun. If Thomas and I were not to roam the woods in Austria, but the inner city of Vienna, shouting whatever kind of obscenities in the middle of the night, thereby waking the neighbors, the police could come and, rightfully so, ask us to tone it down, at least. Whereas Thomas and I were such serious academics, we would never do that. Take it as a hypothetical only. So it wouldn't make any difference if I were really to shoot a gun, not harming anybody, but shooting in the air, or shouting loudly, the disturbing factor to the sleep of my neighbors would be just the same at 3 in the morning, I suppose. This undermines, however, the plausibility of a presumption of free speech protection when it comes to verbal utterances, so when it comes to speaking and writing, which in line of what I previously referred to as functional equivalence of means of communication means we have to examine the conduct in question as to its communicative content. On the other hand, however, coming back to what I emphasized before, considering an unlimited number of human activities as communication, that poses a problem in its own right. For even if an overly narrow concept of speech, as we have just tried to demonstrate, must be considered inadequate, an overly broad concept of speech poses its own problem. Even a very loose knowledge of what the famous psychoanalyst and communication scholar Paul Watzlawick referred to as the meta-communicative axiom would ensure us that Paul Watzlawick's meta-communicative axiom would say, one cannot not communicate. Or we can sum it up for our purpose here. Every expression makes an impression. Us sitting here in this specific configuration, us looking around, necessarily impresses on our minds. Me perceiving you while silent in the audience doesn't mean that you're silent when it comes to the impression that I have by you being here, by you interacting with me, by the way you listen to my lectures or look at your phones. All that is some kind of interaction we may consider for the purpose at hand. So, following an understanding that would largely equate freedom of speech with individual freedom of expression, if you will, every action consistently would benefit from free speech protection. And this would again make freedom of speech nothing but a general freedom of action. And that is, rightly so, deemed somewhat undesirable. The Swiss Federal Constitutional Court, for example, said on this, if in the final analysis all behavior can be interpreted by an observer as conveying information, however small, extending the domain of freedom of expression to all human behavior on this ground would largely render meaningless the other fundamental rights. Because freedom of speech would simply eat them up. There would only be one safeguard necessary to ensure liberty, and that would be freedom of speech. And that is somewhat absurd, ladies and gentlemen. So if we would like to preserve the autonomy of free speech on the one hand and the autonomy of other human rights on the other, we would have to take a closer look at the boundaries that we must draw, that without strictly separating speech from conduct from the outset, take a closer look at the communicative content of an act. So what we would have to investigate now is under which preconditions do we perceive an act as having communicative content. This, however, means that one of the initial assumptions that we use to approach our topics evidently needs to be revised. Because it is not about the form of expression, as the European Court on Human Rights would emphasize, but it is rather the requirements that an act has to meet in order to be considered as one of those signs which men use to communicate with each other. Protection of freedom of expression, thus, and I think rather consistently so, as some scholars would argue, ends where it is not about communication, but about mere social interaction. It is important Therefore, to distinguish mere expression, if you would like, because every expression makes some kind of impression, as we emphasized before, from communication proper. If communication is best understood to include all symbols that have expressive meaning, whatever the form of those symbols, it proves necessary to distinguish acts that have no communicative content from those acts that have what we may refer to as symbolic character. So that brings us closer again to the analysis of our symbolic debate that we started this lecture off. Acts may have, making matters short, symbolic character if they have the quality that they point beyond the mere act itself. Now it gets a little crazy philosophical, but bear with me, it will pay off somewhat. But it is important for us, I think, to understand what we're doing in so many aspects of our lives. We will see, and this is, I mean, you can skip intellectually the next 2 minutes, if you will, yeah? But you need to remember this line to follow me, if you want to follow me. If you don't want to follow me, skip it altogether. Symbolic acts, as we will see, are characterized by the fact that they can be interpreted separately from the actual phenomenon, which thus becomes a medium. So, to make it a bit more plastic, at which point does this microphone stop being a microphone and thus merely a tool for my communication? And at which point does it serve as a medium for communication just in its own right? We may start by referring to the work of the great German philosopher who has been exiled and later ended his career with great publications at our cherished Yale University, Ernst Cassirer, by referring to freedom of individual communication that would encompass everything that is mediated. Sounds a bit complicated, but it wants to say simply that everything that constitutes a medium may qualify as communication. This overcomes the mere facticity, so the mere thing of this being a bottle of water and not a work of art, by constituting this as a work of art by symbolic means, if you will. And what we have to undergo here, and this is a very important aspect of the human condition, is we undergo a process of abstraction, if you will, that is or speaks as to us as beings that have a way of discovering the world and has an objectifying power beyond the animalistic immediacy, beyond what we think that animals who lack this abstract capacity would perceive in this bottle of water. That is, if an animal would be capable of conceiving this as a bottle of water. There is research on some animal species that would perhaps indicate that they could go this far. As of now, in my understanding, it is only the human race that is capable of perceiving this bottle of water in certain settings, and we'll come back to that, as a work of art in its reflective capacity. Humans have what we may refer to as symbolic capacity. So we can see beyond things as they present themselves to us. And this is what Jürgen Habermas would refer to as a process of spiritual distancing. And it goes back basically to what Aristotle said about the human being. It's zoon echon logon. You may have heard that already back in your studies. It is an animal that is designated by the fact that it has the capacity to speak. So that is the distinctive feature of humankind already back according to the views of Aristotle. And inherent to that is our symbolic capacity, our capacity to abstraction. What we may refer to as a rational animal only applies to man overall, because man is a symbolic animal. An animal to which the limits of its language or its abstractive capacity indeed mean the limits of its world, as Wittgenstein has emphasized it. And a world that is in all its aspects only to be conceived by the way of concepts, and it is thus only in all its aspects symbolically accessible to the individual, and it is only communicable in this symbolic capacity. Noam Chomsky would, for example, emphasize, if some hominid has a language capacity, that is in bracket the necessary capacity for abstraction, brackets closed, it can plan, it can think, it can interpret, it can imagine other situations, situations that aren't around, and make choices among them or have attitudes towards them. At some stage in the development of this hominid, it can convey some of that to others. Language, we can summarize with Jürgen Habermas, shapes the consciousness of the speaking subject and at the same time provides them with a medium for the expression of their own experience. We're nearly through. So, to sum up, symbolic acts thus overcome the immediacy of the factual that is constituted in the act itself, as it constitutes the act beyond the facticity of the actual phenomenon as a medium. This being a work of art, no longer a bottle of water. This being, in its own right, a feature of communication, not only a tool for communication. So the medial character of communication as a symbolic act of conveying meaning detached from the actual phenomenon is at the very center of our discussion. And now that we have somewhat delimited the terrain of our discussion, we can transcend the boundary of verbal and non-verbal forms of expression, and we can take into account what we referred to above as the functional equivalence that would ask us to define criteria that would again allow us to determine which acts are to be included as symbolic in the scope of our free speech protection. The Americans, as often, have been much faster than the Europeans in doing so. In a very famous case of the US Supreme Court called Spence versus Washington, the American court basically defined two items that conduct would have to meet to qualify as symbolic conduct in our aforementioned sense. And these two items are, perhaps you might consider them for your future reference. First and foremost, the intention to convey a specific message, and then its contextual reception, if you will. For the European Court of Human Rights, not among the early adopters when it comes to that, it took decades to come up with a test of similar rigor. Only in 2014, when hardly any one of you were born, 6 years old, in a case called Murat Vural versus Turkey, the court went into the same direction. Before that, the court has been very generous in including any kind of conduct in the scope of free expression without ever explaining why. As the Czech Constitutional Court observed, this test, the Murat Vural test, is closely resembling the criteria that have been developed by the US Supreme Courts. They would combine subjective elements, so my communicative intent, my being willing to speaking to you in the first place, and objective elements, that is the reception of what I try to tell you in the conduct, or by using the conduct in question. That brings us to the communicative content that we discussed before. This doesn't come as a surprise. If we have a closer look as lawyers into theory of speech, so linguistic theory, we would have known and learned from H.B. Grice and his famous model of communication that communication is essentially based on the interplay of the communicative intention of an actor, its disclosure to an addressee, and its recognition by an addressee. So the interplay of the subjective and the objective, as we have referred to it before, may be considered commonplaces, if you will, in communication theory. And thus, even if courts such as the US Supreme Court or the European Court of Human Rights would state clearly that communicative intent, my being willing to speak to you, would not suffice to qualify as free speech, it is nevertheless the necessary starting point for our discussion or our analysis as to the communicative content of the action in question. If an unlimited number of monkeys had an unlimited number of typewriters and an unlimited amount of time, they would necessarily, by the dictates of mere logic, come up with Karl Marx's Capital at one point. This, however, wouldn't qualify as speech because our cherished monkeys on their unlimited typewriters would lack communicative intent proper, if you will. And against that backdrop, we can already exclude some of the examples that we have developed here when it comes to our further consideration. Thomas and I, walking in the woods, trying to scare off the wild boar, and successfully so, because we have strong survival instincts, Thomas and I, we have no communicative intent. So even if we are reciting Shakespeare sonnets in the woods, doesn't qualify as communication. It's just us making noise, basically. But if we come back to the great debate, what about the Pope, who produces the wine and the bread at the end of the great debate? He certainly had the intention to convey meaning. It was, however, not received as such, because the rabbi thought that they would break for lunch. Does this qualify as communication, therefore? To require communicative intention as an intention to, let's say, convey meaning requires surely more than simply investigating the mindset of the person who performs the act in question. It implies, as already Grice has indicated, not to assume a speaker who acts intentionally, but also an, even if only potential, recipient towards whom the communicative intention may unfold. Communication thus presupposes both a communicator, somebody with the intent to convey meaning, and a communicatee, somebody who, even if only potentially, would be in a position to receive said message. As the Austrian Constitutional Court, my own court, we take great pride in the Austrian Constitutional Court, puts it, a third party to whom communicative content is attributed is necessary vis-à-vis the conduct in question. Because, again, my dear friend Fred Schauer, communication may be considered, and I think that is one of the wisest things that has ever been written on freedom of speech, a joint enterprise. And only such a joint enterprise may trigger the principle of free speech. So what we have here in front of us is a dialogical structure, and that presupposes the recipient making use of her symbolic capacity and that presupposes an autonomous appreciation of the impression that is conveyed by the communicator. This mirrors somewhat what has long been held in legal scholarship. Communicative action is related to behavior of the other, and it is directed to the other in its course. The act in question, as some of my colleagues put it, needs at least to be potentially suitable to reach the other in order to determine him or her in her order and action. Potentially is of particular importance here because we do not presuppose success when it comes to said communicative intent. As the Hungarian Constitutional Court put it, freedom of speech presupposes that the means chosen of communication can be objectively regarded as a suitable medium for the communication of ideas. The Pope, in producing Wine and Bread, met this threshold. In the meantime, before coming back to that, the observations made so far allow us to take a closer look at the bombings, at the assassinations, and at the self-immolations that I mentioned above. This closer look warrants a distinction, at least to my mind, and I'm particularly curious what you would say about that. First, and most importantly, any act of violence from the very outset, according to my model at least, has no claim to any symbolic quality that overcomes the act in question. And that is irrespective of the fact whether the actor intends to use them as a means to convey a certain state of mind. They remain attached to what we referred to before as the factual immediacy in their physical reference precisely. Hannah Arendt, the famous political theorist, has emphasized that violence itself is incapable of speech, and thus what the US Supreme Court held for the First Amendment to the US Constitution, that a physical assault is not by any stretch of imagination to be regarded as conduct that is protected as speech, structurally applies to any free speech clause. Against the backdrop of what has been said, there are two strands of reasoning that concern the reception of any communicative intent to be conveyed by violent means. Because first, as the Czech Constitutional Court highlights, these actions, brutal, violent acts, are not perceived by the ordinary observer primarily as communicating information or expressing opinions. So we have a lack when it comes to the objective criterion I referred you to before. And not unimportantly, by the one who experienced the violence in question, they are certainly not perceived as communication in the aforementioned manner. And secondly, as the Hungarian Constitutional Court emphasizes, communicative conduct is designated as conduct that allows those concerned to participate in public social dialogue. It supports thereby, the Hungarian Constitutional Court, the aforementioned dialogical structure that presupposes the recipients or the potential recipients to make use of their symbolic capacity rather than using their capacity to serve as symbols for our message to be conveyed. As the Spanish Constitutional Court has emphasized, the free information of public opinion gives no place for relegating subjects participating in public discourse in autonomously appreciating the impression conveyed to objects to be appreciated. Or to be blunt, and that is perhaps the better summary than the one given by the Spanish Constitutional Court, precisely because free speech allows us, and necessarily allows us, to wrestle for the better argument in an intellectual combat, if you will. It does not allow us to actually wrestle. While the same does not obviously apply to self-immolation that employ the communicator's own symbolic capacity to serve as a symbol, and that out of her own volition, as a subject that would participate in public discourse. And this, if you were, for example, mutilate your body by adding some brandings, by using it to convey a message by affixing a tattoo to it, or if you were to use it as a means of communication in participating in the aforementioned hunger strike, you make use, out of your own volition, of your own bodily symbolic capacity, and that, of course, is something we would have to consider as within the scope of freedom of expression. However, so far to actual violence, but what about the threat of violence? What about the Pope at the beginning of the Great, or prior to the Great Debate, threatening the expulsion of the Jews from the Papal State? What about any kind of command? Go here, do this, otherwise. What about any kind of threat? What about Thomas forcing me to recite Shakespeare in the first place? And because he's my bodily superior, he threatens me with brute force in doing that. What about all those things? One may argue that a papal decree, or any government decree, if you will, as the aforementioned, being a state act, wouldn't qualify for free speech protection from the very outset. If government would issue an order, if the legislator would pass a law, that is something else than we would usually discuss under free expression. And that might be true, however, against the backdrop of the rationale that we have developed here for the problem at hand, there is structurally no difference between the state and a band of robbers when it comes to binding commands, when it comes to blackmail, as one ECHR scholar put it. Because they may be a speaking expression of an opinion, but they deviate from the concept of what we may consider a free intellectual debate that is underlying the fundamental right in such a manifest manner that one can probably no longer address a law prohibiting them as a restriction of said fundamental rights, that is free speech. It may, at best, serve to clarify its limits. Free speech as a right to communicate, to persuade, and to inform people through the content of what a speaker says, that implies, as has been pointed out, a structure of communication that is based on relatively free, that is relatively free from external coercion, act of intellectual consensus in relation to the content that is submitted in said communication. Facing the imminent threat of a sanction, in the case of non-compliance, such a consensus seems, as has been prominently emphasized by the Spanish Constitutional Court, impossible from the very outset. And not because the content itself would not be open to consensus. In the given example, it is not the content of what is expressed that is not in a position to qualify as a statement of objectionable fact. It is the rather, let's say, superficial dialogical structure in its creation of prospective harmful consequences in order to achieve one's objective. Because what you do in giving an order, what you do in issuing a threat, is nothing more than a mere imperative act. It is the often quoted offer that one cannot refuse. And it has a final character in clearly pointing out the alternative. Give me your money or else. As the Spanish Constitutional Court again has prominently put it, this cannot be considered an element of what qualifies as free intellectual debate, and therefore it is not a component of communication that we would consider protected speech. That is against the backdrop of what has been said about half an hour ago, and we're approaching the end, so you can relax. It is consistent when it comes to the structure of communication in question. If free speech is considered a joint enterprise, it presupposes the recipient as an equal, autonomously evaluating subject of the communicative intention of the speaker, and not as the mere object of his volition to do as the speaker would deem fit. If we were to follow Immanuel Kant's conception of freedom of communication as the authority to do against others what in itself does not diminish their own, if they only do not want to accept it, communication requires the autonomy of the recipient to be able to accept or to reject what has been expressed. Precisely the distance that has been mentioned before that makes such a reaction of the hominid in its abstractive capacity actually possible. As Thomas Scanlon put it, a person must see himself or herself as sovereign in deciding what to believe and in weighing competing reasons for action. That is basically what free speech is about. So, communication encompassed by free speech is thus by no means necessarily devoid of ends. However, it is open-ended. It is a conversation that we're having, even though typically and more often than not by nonverbal means. The threat of violence is thrown back to the intended result, which thus does not overcome the immediacy of the act in question. Free speech intends to influence, not to dictate. This, in our understanding, implies communication as requiring what we may refer to as residual recipient autonomy. The receiver of the communication in question needs to be autonomous in his or her own subjectivity in appreciating what has been conveyed. And thus, at the same time, it includes constellations that would inhibit said autonomy by means of violence and coercion. That is not to be misinterpreted, and this is a rather important point. Free speech presupposes the recipient as an autonomous individual who can either reject or accept views that they hear. However, this does not say necessarily that whatever is heard or said is necessarily being liked, and that whatever is said or heard is necessarily protected speech or speech that would stand the test of proportionality in its own favor. If we're talking about fighting words, if we're talking about hate speech, if we're talking about all this content, but as a matter of structural analysis, with the European Court of Human Rights, free speech, of course, from the outset at least, would have to include not only what is indifferently received, but also, and particularly, the injurious, the shocking, the disturbing statement that is subject to free speech protection. So, while commands, threats, or papal decrees thus may well understood, and nevertheless, or perhaps on the contrary, precisely for that reason, do not qualify for free speech protection, the question of whether symbolism employed to contribute to the free formation of public opinion is to be considered protected speech if its use is not understood. Yeah? Hugo Ball's sound poems that I referred to before, the whole school of Dadaist poetry, assessed in this light, requires further discussion. Because we must take into account the requirement of what is actually conveyed. What does the speaker intend to actually say? And what does the recipient actually receive? Coming back to our friend the Pope and his chalice of wine and the host that he would present. If we were to ask that the speaker's communicative intent and whatever is objectively received or to be received by that, we would be asking too much. You all may be able to relate to conversations you had in the past with your partner, with your parents, with your friends, where you say, you just don't get me. You don't understand me. And that is the misery of human communicative interaction. It is perfectly imprecise because we cannot ever completely communicate our communicative intention. So if we were to say, I need to have 100% success in on the receiving end when it comes to whatever I just said, yeah, we could really disqualify this whole lecture, I suppose, from the protection of free speech. Because I'm not even sure whether I wanted to say 100% of what I've been saying. And I'm pretty sure, on the other hand, that aside from Thomas, nobody took the pains to actually follow 100% of what I've been saying. So is this a lost communicative endeavor that we are just engaging in? And the good news, ladies and gentlemen, is it is not. Before coming back to that, let's clear one or two obstacles. Does that mean, however, speech needs to be as precise as possible? And does that lead us back in the end, again, to human language as the normal type of communication of ideas? We may argue, after all, that a newspaper article who would foul-mouth a certain politician is far more precise than laying down or pouring paint on his statue, if you will, when it comes to the message that is actually conveyed. That is hardly so. Many of you are engaged in your studies here and in your professional experience, and my dear friends and faculty members here know what I'm talking about from painful experience. If we are engaged in interpreting legal texts, we only get an idea of how confusing the written word actually may be for all it's worth. Therefore, we may refer to what has already been said by Plato in the Phaedrus, that whoever believes that something put in writing would have something clear and reliable emerge from those letters must be highly simple-minded. I very much follow this view. So the spoken or the written word does not serve as a potential yardstick of what would be the gold standard of the reception of the speaker's intention. And against this backdrop, it is not feasible to place excessive demands on the definiteness of a statement uttered. And this, again, I would say, directs our attention to the question of the communicative nature of the respective act by focusing less on the content of a particular utterance, but rather in accordance with a, let's say, pragmatic interpretation of the communicative act, as we have previously emphasized it, on the relationship of those involved in the act of communication. It is primarily decisive, and that is one of my core points, so please kindly take it with you. No longer what is being communicated, so the message itself, but rather building on the intended conveyance of meaning, irrespective of its vagueness. It is important that it is being communicated. Indeed, the medium, even if in a very different meaning here, is the message. You may have come across Marshall McLuhan's famous dictum, the medium is the message. Indeed, according to my theory, it is even coming from a quite different place. Because if the medium is the message, obviously the important thing is not what somebody says in a given medium, but that the medium is constituted by somebody saying something. Pouring paint on a statue, it may have 123,431 different shades or facets of specific meaning. But if we perceive it as communication, we perceive it as communication that would basically give us the impression this guy feels uncomfortable with that guy. Okay. Consistently, however, this view must influence the understanding of inherent symbolism. For if a precise meaning of whatever kind of the statement in question is not to be regarded as decisive for it to be protected, it would appear inconsistent if we would say that some symbols have a very clear-cut communicative character, or some symbols carry an unambiguous message, if you will. In the famous flag-burning case, Texas versus Johnson, for example, by the US Supreme Court, the court would say that the flag is pregnant with expressive character, and still we cannot consider each misuse of the flag as a communicative act. If you were just to throw it away because you were cleaning your house, what about the symbolic quality of the thing? Yeah, you're just getting rid of something that you deem unnecessary because, meanwhile, you find the US is... but it is not the sign of public protest that has been associated with the outset of communication, as in the flag-burning cases such as US v. Eichmann, Texas versus Johnson. An act of a driver who parked his car in a way that the truck cannot access a nearby construction site. This may as well be the driver's carelessness, or it may be a deliberate act of obstruction when it comes to said construction work, because I'm protesting at the moment by parking my car in a way to block it. Just the same, that at the same time, presenting wine and bread may be a reminder that in the speaker's perception, God's Son died for the sins of mankind, or it may be the invitation indeed to have a lunch break. This assumption of inherent symbolism wouldn't qualify as bringing us this far. So the question is, and the last question is, what makes the difference? How can we perceive this as reminding us of God's Son having died for the sins of mankind, from let's have lunch? And the answer to that is born in one specific and decisive element that would complete the two criteria that I have mentioned before, as developed by the United States Supreme Court in Spence versus Washington: communicative intent on the one hand, and the reception on the other hand. It is not about any kind of reception. It is always about, ladies and gentlemen, the reception of said communicative act in a specific context. So the ECTHR, the European Court of Human Rights, would time and again explicitly stress in its case law that having regard to the applicant's conduct and its context, the court would only accept that he or she sought to convey certain ideas. The context constitutes the symbol in the perception of the addressee. And thus, this comes hardly as a surprise, because if communication is a social practice, it exists only within particular social contexts. So the function of the context, however, as a multitude of national high court case law does indicate, is there to serve basically two things. It creates the symbol in and by itself in a specific setting. So the rabbi just got it wrong, if you will, because this is a theological debate. Why should the Pope break for lunch in the end? Objectively assessed, at least. It constitutes the symbol in a given context. So next time you're around the Pope and he raises a chalice of wine and presents a piece of bread, you would say, this is not an invitation to have lunch. This would be really unpolite. But perceive it in the context that it is presented. And as the courts would agree, European High Court case law throughout would agree, this is something that would also and necessarily allow us, even if in a very vague manner from time to time, to approach the communicative character of an act in question when it comes to terms of content. So to determine what is actually being said. The context-related appraisal of an act as communicative, that necessitates an approach to its content as it often cannot be, let's say, taken in isolation from an examination of the concern that is actually being pursued by the speaker or by the meaning the speaker indeed intends to convey. The context of an utterance we may sum up with the American linguist Samuel Hayakawa, determine its meaning. So the context of the act in question is set, allows us to either, if you were of Christian faith, to recognize Christ's blood and body in a chalice of wine and a piece of bread, and the poem, in the sound poem presented by Hugo Ball, and not some perfectly useless and undecipherable scribbling. The context allows us to have symbolic debates in the first place, notwithstanding the various misunderstandings that may accompany those debates, notwithstanding the fact that you can go ahead and say, you just don't get me, I try to explain it to you over and over again, but you don't get me. Fine communication still. And the context allows us overall, and I would like to end on that note, to engage from a free speech perspective in the great debate that we are engaged in as mankind, as imperfect as it may be, and we will be involved in it, or so I hope, as long as there is free speech. I thank you very much for your cherished attention, and I'm very much looking forward to discussing one or another problem that has perhaps not convinced you in the aftermath. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Christoph, for this wonderful lecture, very comprehensive on one hand, but very complex on the other hand. And, you know, without further ado, I open the discussion. Yes, please.
First of all, thank you, Dr. Christoph, for, first of all, the amazing article. I was really enjoying reading it, and for your beautiful sense of humor. Second of all, there is this issue about the definition, or there is this, how does other acts or refraining from acts fare with the two main clauses that you need to have speech? For instance, in Nazi Germany, when somebody used to say Sieg, the other would say Heil as a salute. If somebody was to refrain from saying Heil as a freedom of speech, I don't want to say Heil because that's my choice. I want to convey this message, and at the same time, people around me are in receipt of this message. How does that fare with the definition or the what the case law has determined. And in another speech, in another example, refraining from any conduct, such as when there's a national anthem and everybody is supposed to be standing up and one person has remained seated, or refrain from singing along to the national anthem. That is an idea that I had while reading your article. Is refraining from conduct, or refraining from conduct, speech, or refraining from speech is speech? We have a saying in our country that silence is speech. So is there something in the international court system that says, yes, you can remain silent as a speech, as something like that? Thank you.
Thank you so much. These are both excellent points and very important for you to raise them. First, both of the situations that you require are structurally related in that somebody doesn't meet an expectation in a given context. And this expectation is that clear-cut that it cannot be missed that somebody wants to say or convey some meaning by doing just that. If in Nazi Germany I refrain from answering Heil to Sieg, that would be something. If my grandmother has been a very Catholic woman, and she told me the story that in the staircase she lived in an apartment building where the Blockwart was somebody who was in charge of spying on the neighborhood, basically, seeing whether all of them were good National Socialists. The Blockwart made fun or made himself the game every day when he encountered her in the hallway, and he would greet her by the standard greeting at that time and say Heil Hitler, whereas she would always refer to Grüß Gott. That is literally translated. It's the standard Austrian greetings, typically used by Catholics. God may be greeted, or I greet God in you. And it was clear from that context that she didn't share his firm conviction, and that really, of course, enraged him and made her subject to suspicion. Your example is just the same. If you were to say Sieg in this context, I would were to refrain from saying Heil in this context. That would be highly suspicious at best. So that is shared, of course, with me not getting up when the national anthem is being played, or coming back to a more recent example, when I decide to kneel down when the national anthem is played, as has been introduced in the National Football League in the US, heavily criticized by former President Donald Trump. They got the message that you were not okay with things going on in the US. So we can see from this backdrop, even though the first uses language, the language capacity of the human, the second does not distinctly, in the context, we may understand from the objective perspective that the courts asked us to introduce that there is something going on that we may deem communicative. And as you were asking for specific case law, there exists case law, and funny enough, it has been developed in Europe as well as in the US against the backdrop of the convictions of one religious group that are very firm, and those are the Jehovah's Witnesses. In Greece, for example, there are many cases in the Jehovah's Witnesses who refuse to partake in parades when it comes to the national holiday. The Jehovah's Witnesses who refuse to engage in school prayers in the US, for example, etc., etc. What we would commonly refer to these situations is the negative aspect of freedom of speech, which is just as protected. However, if you think of it, and that is why I'm so happy for your examples, there is nothing negative about this at all. It is just in the given context as much positive communication to remain silent, as you so elegantly put it, as to speak up. Thank you.
Zachary? Hello, and thank you for the very informative lecture. I guess my main problem was that if we define freedom of expression on the idea that we're communicating meaning and somebody else is receiving it, then isn't that still making it very broad, which is one of the things that the article is trying to avoid, I guess. Because when I manifest, I'm basically trying to send a message. When I move, I don't know, when the Syrians went as refugees, they're basically saying that we don't want to stay here, and that's exactly like the example mentioned there. And so freedom of expression in that sense still kind of encompasses all of the other freedoms. And I'm afraid that I'm not sure if it is even possible to avoid that, because it's related to autonomy, agency, free will. All of these are linked to freedom of expression. And at the same time, they're linked to every other kind of right. So I'm not sure whether in all the attempts that I read about trying to make freedom of expression narrow somehow, there is always this problem somehow. And there is the problem of violence. I'm not sure I understood the first part, like when you have
neither was I.
like when it comes to violence, when it's between multiple people, it's understood. It's me committing violence against other people. But the self-emulating acts, these I'm not really sure whether the article is saying that's part of freedom of expression or not. Because I definitely, when I look at the Tunisian case and Bouazizi burning himself, it's definitely communicating meaning as well. And as not just communicate meaning, it actually did to millions and millions of people. So we cannot really say by this definition that it's not part of freedom of expression. I'm still also, just to follow up on what my friend said there, the act of remaining silent, sometimes it doesn't want to convey meaning that I'm against this or not, or I just want to be left alone. And that needs to be protected, even if it does not convey any meaning in a sense. That's it.
Perfect. Thank you. This is a great audience. Let's start from the back. That is why communicative intent is so important. If you just want to be left alone, and that is the specific words that you just employed, and that is quite telling, the right to be left alone is not the right to free speech. The right to free speech is always the right to engage. The right to be left alone is the right to privacy. And it is thus a distinct freedom, absent any communicative intention, at least in my mind, that has to be employed according to its own idiosyncrasies when it comes to that. And evidently, the context is telling when it comes to those things, but the context doesn't tell you all. Coming back, and that is why the interplay between communicative intent and contextual perception is so important. Coming back to your second point, I'm not sure. Thomas and I, we discussed this yesterday, even if only briefly. To make it short, when it comes to your first part of your second point, yes, self-emulations qualify according at least to my model as free speech. So if we were there is. Within the way we employ our bodies in order to communicate, no useful distinction, to my mind, I think, to be made between extending this hand, pointing at something, using it as a symbol, like this, for example, or anything else. There's some way to make a heart out of this. This is a love symbol. Somewhere. It works with those youngsters in the bands do it all the time. How does it work? This is love. Okay, so very good. Yeah, see, and from me using my body as a medium in a different capacity. Yeah, by having Thomas tattoo me. Would you be willing to do that?
To tattoo you?
Yeah.
Yeah, it depends on the content.
It depends on the content. Very good. He's got moral standards. He's a high-standing moral individual. And it's one of the major differences between him and me. So if I were to brand myself, if I were to cut off my arm, or if I was indeed taking the final step, ending my own life as a means of symbolic process. However, the question that makes your example so difficult is, was there the specific communicative intent, and was it received in the specific context, or was the context in its specificity rather created in the afterward? Was the action in question rather contextualized by the way those discussing it and using it as a symbol later on perceived it, than being understood in this very own context? And that is, in my mind, according to my model, the only distinction that we can validly make. I spent some time thinking about this after I discussed it with Thomas yesterday, and I think this is the only reasonable explanation I can come up with. But Thomas wants to jump in.
Yeah, no, just to follow up on that, yeah, I come to the similar conclusion that we might be talking about two different exercises of speech, the burning itself, and then use that burning as symbol by somebody reminding, about this moment. But if we come just to the act itself, would you find some problems regarding the or necessary condition, where I see one bit in the joint enterprise, as Schauer would call it, or dialogical way? Is it exhausted just by the communication from the communicator to the recipient, or does it require at least a potential back communication? Given the fact that the situation, the communicator burned himself, so he doesn't exist. So is that problematic? And of course, I mean, in this case, you don't need so much freedom of protection as the person doesn't exist. But from your systemic analysis, whether this process, interpersonal of communicating, requires at least potential back communication.
Not necessarily. I mean, but it's a great point, and also Thomas has given me the advantage of thinking about it somewhat, because yesterday we briefly, at least, brushed on that. Think about me writing a novel instead of doing honest scholarly work. Because I consider myself to be a far superior novelist than a legal scholar. And I write this novel back home, but I'm afraid, because I'm very self-absorbed, of how my novel would be received. And so I never publish it. And my friend Thomas, after cleaning out my apartment, when I've passed, finds the novel. And I speak to Thomas, or he reads my diary, or whatever. That would qualify in the very outset, even years after I have passed. That, I think, wouldn't make the decisive difference. That the act of speaking actually destroys the speaker may strike us as odd indeed. However, so far I haven't come across a convincing argument that should speak against it, but perhaps I shall overthink it. The paper is to be published with Cambridge, I think, a year from now, so if any of you have good ideas why I should change this paragraph, feel free to approach me anytime. This brings me back to your first point. Isn't this still rather broad? Yes, it is. However, that's not that problematic. First of all, it is less broad than all the other approaches I came across, and that is something to me. Secondly, you have to take into account the different models and traditions free speech follows in various jurisdictions. Take the US, for example. US follows a completely different approach than the European Court on Human Rights, which is why the US is considered to be very protective when it comes to speech. Why is that so? That is so because the US Supreme Court has developed what it refers to as the so-called categorical approach. There are only certain well-defined, so-called Chaplinsky catalog. There are only certain well-defined categories of speech that are unprotected. Fighting words. If Thomas and I met and we were to insult each other on the street, which could lead potentially at least to a fist fight between the two of us, pornography, and some acts of commercial interaction, and other varieties, such as incitement, the famous case of shouting fire in the crowded theater. Yeah? These categories would be unprotected. Everything outside the unprotected characters would be fine with the free speech principle as protected in the U.S. Yeah? And the European model is rather different when it comes to that, because the European model says, "Oh, let them come. Yeah? I don't care about categorization. I will simply balance it off. Yeah? I can accept a very broad scope of speech to qualify a speech in the first place, in order then to engage in a balancing exercise that would, in the end, and give or take, all European jurisdictions work that way, that give or take would then qualify certain acts as speech, but by ways of balancing exclude hate speech, for example. Yeah? Not because hate speech is not speech, but hate speech is speech we consider undesirable in our society. And that is the only reason why free speech protection is more robust in the US than in Europe. There is no difference, at least to my mind, when it comes to the scope of protection of both safeguards.
To give the audience a little bit more time to thought about additional question, I will try to follow up on some categories, and it's connected to the breadth of what to include in the free speech. The first was the concept of violence and how does it work. I understood from you that
You keep coming back to that, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay.
I like that. So you say violence is not speech for a number of arguments, which the most persuasive seems to me to be that the violence constrain the autonomy of the recipient. However, you defined violence not only as physical, but also, you define it also as including threat of violence, which means it's not only physical, but also psychological. If you do that, isn't some degree of violence almost present always in speech? If you take, flag burning in a patriotic country, burning of a holy book in a religious society, it will definitely cause psychological injuries to some. And I don't know whether the idea, I see some ways through this idea of autonomy, that is whether it affects, despite the violence felt, affect my behavior or not, whether there is effect to the autonomy, but still it seems to me that it's better to work with some degree of it than as an absolute category excluding the speech.
Oh, that's brilliant. Thank you. And very important. Well, yes, it is difficult to draw the line. However, I would say not impossible. The US Supreme Court in particular has developed standards in addressing this. It may come in handy to refer to the fighting words doctrine that I introduced before. So if Thomas and I were to, that's where these cases originated basically. If Thomas and I were to meet on a crossing, and I would have the right of way, and Thomas would take it from me, and I would be angered, and I would start shouting at Thomas and calling him names, and he would start shouting names back. What kind of interaction is this? Is this an interaction that is protected by free speech, or is this an exercise in surveying who of us has the more colorful vocabulary? In the end, the US Supreme Court said, well, such fighting words, such as Thomas and Christoph meeting at a crossing and shouting insults at each other, don't qualify as speech because, abstractly assessed, they would have the same intensity as if we were not fighting by mere words, but engage in an actual fight. So that is the standard the US Supreme Court would apply. Hasn't been applied for quite some decades now. Some scholars therefore think the doctrine is dead. I tend to disagree. But if you have a somewhat objective standard as to when the exchange of words or insults and the actual engagement in a fist fight do amount basically to the same, that is a road that you can travel at least. Also when it comes to threats. Oliver Wendell Holmes, the great American jurist and Supreme Court justice, has coined a very important phrase. It has been taken up in different words, even if not as correctly in the result by the European Court of Human Rights in its Handyside judgment. Oliver Wendell Holmes said, free speech is not freedom for those who agree with us. Free speech is freedom for the thought that we hate. And the European Court of Human Rights in its famous Handyside judgments from the 1970s said that free speech protection is warranted, in particular also for the content that we find shocking, for the content that we find disturbing. And therefore, the content of the message in and by itself must be irrelevant for whether or not free speech protection applies from the very outset. So whether I can see something as within the scope of protection of free speech in the first place. Why are there threats then excluded from free speech protection, and why does that apply as well for the American Supreme Court as for the European Court of Human Rights, even though the European Court of Human Rights, to my knowledge at least, has not issued a judgment that would explicitly say so. First and foremost, I abbreviated the matter a little before. The US Supreme Court talks not about threats in general, but about true threats, threats on which you would immediately follow through, and therefore would predict the outcome either way. So you either hand me your money or you give me your life. Choice is basically up to you. However, the result is final. I'm not engaging in this kind of open conversation that would warrant at least a trifling moment of autonomy on behalf of the recipient of the message. And thus, I think it is important to say that this residual part of recipient autonomy is what makes this distinction actually worthwhile. And this is the same with violence actually happening to a third party that I use as an example for my communication. That is me killing Thomas in front of you. Thomas will be very unhappy, and I would significantly disregard his autonomy as a recipient. And in our communication, a little, he says at least, very good. I would say significantly, I would be so generous. In our conversation, that would be the end of it. So I don't give him a chance from the very outset to engage in some kind of dialogue. I don't even want to convince him. Maybe I want to convince you by shooting him. Convincing you that I would shoot you next, maybe, or whatever. That is where the Czech Constitutional Court comes in, which is why the example is not the argument from personal autonomy is the smarter one. You're perfectly correct on that. But however, what it does in the specific context, the Czech Constitutional Court is quite right about that, because you can't really be sure is this guy trying to make a point or is this guy trying to make a threat, and that would basically it. It is a matter of degree, that is true. However, if applied with the necessary diligence, I think that is not an obstacle that is not to be overcome.
Yes, Ikram.
Hi, thank you so much. I enjoyed reading your article and thank you so much for your lecture. I don't know if the questions I'll be asking now will make it more complicated or if I will have an answer for that, but I would love to hear your opinion. So, if we consider that every type of speech is a speech that expresses certain ideas under certain context, do you think that at some point when we have a speech going against another speech will always result a misunderstanding or at some point there will be a middle ground created? Also, what if speech was not limited by constitution? Does freedom of speech need to be limited in the first place?
Thank you. That's heavy stuff. Um, okay. First and foremost, can we ever sort it out? You were diligently referring to middle ground. Can we find middle ground in what we say? I am convinced so. However, never permanently. That is the question, and the very complicated question. You were perfectly correct when it comes to that, as to the interrelation of free speech and truth. Is there truth to be found in discourse, and what kind of truth is it? Is it absolute truth out there on whatever matter of policy, for example, I would like to discuss with you, or is the truth always something relative to my personal opinion? We have a large and rich history in the history of ideas when it comes to Western thinkers such as Milton, such as Mill, such as Oliver Wendell Holmes or Brandeis, who would tackle this question. And I think the idea that was originally coined by Oliver Wendell Holmes as the marketplace of ideas, he never referred explicitly to it as the marketplace of ideas. That was only made up later. Holmes would refer to it as the free trade in ideas, that the free trade in ideas would bring us into a conversation as to those ideas that we can never resolve permanently. Also, if we were willing to find middle ground, the middle ground would shift permanently, simply because arguments and counter-arguments in this free trade of ideas would find each other, and in having found each other, would never start leaving the other alone. So even if consensus is reached on a certain question, and it is settled, it is something that is never to be considered permanent, but only a preliminary consensus. That is what makes our great debate as vague as it makes our great debate only of a temporary character. I find no fault in it. The second question is nearly impossible to answer because it asks for policy preferences in your own right. I have described before that free speech protection, according to the First Amendment of the US Constitution, is considered, and rightly so, particularly robust. It is basically a way for the speaker to say anything as horrific, as demeaning, as shocking, as degrading as he or she wants. The model that I come from, European model of free speech, is of course far less robust when it comes to the principle of proportionality that I discussed before, and things that are being outbalanced when it comes to the actual assessment of the courts in question, which is why speech which US scholars cannot even comprehend why it shouldn't be protected, is prohibited in Europe, for example. Think about revisionist statements, coming back to your point from the beginning. If you were to deny the Holocaust in Austria, you have 10 years of jail awaiting you. If you were to deny the Holocaust in the beautiful state of Virginia a couple of years ago, you would be commended by the president. So that is indeed a significant distinction. Americans have no idea as to why, and there are hardly any scholars, prominent scholars at least, there's
there is but one, who tried to introduce the hate speech idea into US discourse, whereas we find it normal to ban hate speech in European jurisdictions, even though we very much struggle, and this is what makes hate speech as a concept somewhat problematic. We struggle significantly with a definition of what actually constitutes hate speech. An American scholar or an American court would simply say, well, that's speech, and thus it is protected. It is two different approaches, I think, that we talk here in substance, and only time will tell which one is to be preferred. And it is also a strong commitment to a society which of the values that are embedded in fundamental rights are to be considered what we may perceive as preferred freedoms. Certainly, free speech is one of the, if not the preferred freedom in the United States. Certainly in Europe it is not. And certainly in Europe, privacy, for example, plays a far greater role in the importance and in the sensibilities and sensitivities that we have when it comes to those aspects than free speech, for example. We don't understand why our friends in the US, for example, easily discard certain elements of data protection that we consider essential according to the data protection regulation on a European level. And the Americans will never get us why we are so weak when it comes to what they consider protected speech. So there is indeed an ocean between those two traditions, I think, when it comes to that.
Before giving word to Dr. Matas, just follow up on this. I was wondering when I was reading the draft paper whether your system is answering also to the question of hate speech. That is whether the necessary condition, the communicative content, intent, content, reception, and so on, are sufficient in themselves to identify hate speech, or something more needs to be done to filter it out. So in other words, whether this, through this we just identify free speech, including the hate speech, and then we need to do some additional operation if we want to.
Thank you. No, this is a very important point, and it basically, I think it builds on what we discussed before. Yeah? How can you say, well, this is inconvenient speech, this is hurtful speech, this is hate speech, this is a threat, this is incitement, maybe even. Yeah? And where to draw the line here? I said before, we in Europe are struggling to draw it. However, according at least to my structural analysis, I would say, or answer in this manner, hate speech is speech, either in the US or in Europe. The US, of course, considered it protected speech, whereas Europe doesn't, but that is a question for the proportionality analysis and not for the scope of the safeguard in question. And as a matter of proportionality analysis, to my mind at least, it is a question of policy and the question of whether certain policies can be justified or withstand the proportionality analysis in a given context, because that is what it necessarily means to face and to make this decision that would refer to what has been a part of the very excellent question that has been asked from the audience.
Dr. Matas.
Thank you, Professor Bismek, for this insightful presentation. Well, I'd like just to broaden the discussion somehow on the possibility of having a global or universal understanding of freedom of expression, because it seems to me that when human rights defenders advocating for freedom of expression, they act as freedom of expression is clearly defined, and it is not. I mean, you were talking about European approaches, there is the American approach, but there is also the UN Human Rights Committee has entirely different approach when it comes to relationship between freedom of expression and religious sensibilities, and this is one of the gray zone, and I will come back to this point. And also the question of hate speech or this incitement to discrimination. Because I personally, a little bit not comfortable about using the term hate speech, mainly when racial hate speech somehow clear, but religious hate speech for me is a little bit ambiguous because you are here protecting doctrine or protecting individuals. For me, freedom of expression, any limitation on freedom of expression should protect individuals, not protecting ideologies or religious doctrine. Or the Human Rights Committee also took a strict approach when it comes to historical truth as well, discussing, historical issues or event and the ability to challenge some of these facts. Back to religious sensibility, freedom of expression and religious sensibility. Right now in Europe, there is growing, starting from Salman Rushdie, Danish cartoons, to latest Charlie Hebdo incident, there is now growing consensus in different European legal jurisdictions that blasphemy laws should not be applied. In UK, for example, they repealed blasphemy law and applied instead incitement to discrimination or incitement to violence. But still, the European Court of Human Rights apply very flexible criteria when it comes to religious sensibility and freedom of expression. So do you think in the future there will be change in the European Court that reflects this global discomfort in enlarging the scope of blasphemy laws? Because we saw recently this attack against Salman Rushdie in the United States, again, repeat the discussion on the limit of freedom of expression and to what extent, freedom of expression should not be restricted when it comes to blasphemy restrictions. European Court, for example, says that freedom of expression means shocking views, but at the same time, religious sensibility need to be considered. But blasphemy laws restrict this kind of free debate on religious doctrine. So there is some kind of gray zone here when it comes to the relationship between freedom of expression and respecting religious sensibilities. And respecting religious sensibility is part of freedom of religion. So here there is a relationship between freedom of expression and religious freedom also. European Court does not consider, I think, religious sensibility is part of religious freedom, but at the same time it gives state space to restrict freedom of expression in order to protect religious sensibilities. So what do you see this debate on blasphemy in European legal jurisdiction?
And, very important points. Thank you so much. First and foremost, indeed, when it comes to the recommendations of the Human Rights Committee, Article 19 of the ICCPR and Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights, they would follow along different paths in many of the results that they would have. However, structurally, I think they're rather comparable. And the way Article 19 is handled by the relevant UN human rights bodies, more or less, mirrors the way it is handled by the European Court of Human Rights. That doesn't come as a surprise. As you know, of course, Article 19 ICCPHR, as many aspects of the ICCPHR have been role models for the drafters of the European Convention on Human Rights, and therefore it has been a copycat endeavor drafting the European Convention, at least to some extent. And the way that it is handled evenly may also, and in particular, reflect that fact, even if the results in the end, but that is, again, typically a question that is settled on a proportionality test basis, may indeed differ. When it comes to the way we address some of these issues, as you have indicated, it seems that we are headed in an interesting direction, because blasphemy was dead in Europe for decades. I once, when I was a young assistant professor, and reading an article in an Austrian newspaper, that was my first op-ed, and the article in the newspaper stated the Irish they're introducing a new blasphemy clause in their criminal code, and it's so bad. And nowadays, how can you do that? And I wrote to the newspaper, and they published it. I was one of the proudest moments of my career back then, first time being published in a newspaper. Guys, have you ever looked into our criminal code? Yeah, we have a much stricter blasphemy law still on the books. Yeah, it is just not applied. So now we're coming in an interesting position of these reminiscent clauses and paragraphs to be reapplied and handled in a Europe that is not very sure on how to handle this against the backdrop of the hate speech discussion that we have here. To my mind, Timothy Garton Ash, who is a very interesting thinker overall, but has published a very interesting monograph on free speech, is right when he says we have to make a decision. Whom do we protect? Do we protect the belief? That is the doctrine, as you mentioned before, or do we protect the believer? Yeah? And either way you answer this question, yeah, you will come up on the other way on the other end of the hate speech debate. Yeah? As a matter of policy, I think this question, I've indicated as much to Thomas before, this question remains unresolved. At the moment, it rather seems that Europe is headed in a direction that will bring it farther from the US take on those matters than it has been in the past. You see that in the criminal code, that even if blasphemy laws still are not necessarily the favorite pet child of judges in Central European jurisdictions, incitement provisions that may, of course, we've had a chance to briefly discuss this before, serve the same purpose. They are getting expanded and expanded, and that is a development of which I'm not sure whether or not it already has come to an end. And against the backdrop of the margin of appreciation approach of the European Court of Human Rights in this specific setting, we may overall say that the court is, of course, willing to provide an excess control in these matters, however, would perceive itself as not being in a position of interfering with the national legislator when it comes to these specific questions.
Yeah, Zakaria.
Okay, just a little follow-up on the question that Dr. Matej just asked. I think I don't know if you'd agree with that or not, the very existence of religious freedom clause sort of suggests that we're more interested in the doctrine itself than the people. Because at the core of it, it's going to be no different than freedom of expression itself. It's just a sort of opinion that we take doctrinally and make it sort of so important in the sense that we created the right itself. But at the bottom of it, it's no different than somebody says that I don't believe, or writing an article about, I don't know, whatever topic it is. At the end, it's just the right of freedom of expression. Perhaps we can add also freedom of conscience, because it has the belief part. But still, out of these two rights, I don't see how it could be independent unless we give more importance to the doctrine than the individual.
Okay, interesting. You are very much in agreement with a particularly successful group of revolutionaries in 18th century Europe. The Declaration of the Rights of the Man and of the Citizen in the aftermath of the French Revolution perceived it in just sad manner, when it would state that free speech is protected, and as a subset of free speech, so is freedom of religion. Nowadays, evidently, we perceive these moments in international human rights catalogs, just as in national human rights catalogs, to be of a different variety. There are certain aspects, of course, where free speech and freedom of religion merge and mingle. When it comes to the institutional consequences, however, of the freedom of worship, in particular, when it comes to aspects of freedom of conscience, so not actually only refraining from getting up when the hymn is or the national anthem is being played, but rather than doing that, having a very strong commitment, be it out of a general set of secular beliefs or a general set of religious beliefs. Coming back to our friends, the Witnesses of Jehovah, the right to actually refuse to partake in any kind of military service. That would be something that would be, of course, much closer to a permanent position held by the individual in what we generally refer to as the forum internum, that anything that would be communicated on the outside, or not necessarily the same. However, of course, when it comes to communicating views of the religious variety, but also the political variety, because the freedom to have a distinct set of secular beliefs, just the same as the freedom to utter those beliefs when it comes to free speech. I would not perceive those freedoms as being necessarily in a interrelation to each other, that the one should include the other, but rather that both interact to a great extent when it comes to that. That also in this regard, freedom of religion, however, still has its own extension and is not only perceived as a mere subset of free speech, does, and this far I agree with you, tell us about our policy convictions when assessing what counts as human right in the first place.
Okay, I think it's time to wrap up this part of our discussion. We can continue in over the lunch, to which I would like all to invite at the expense of the Doha Institute, where we can continue in the discussion on the content of the lecture, but also some other questions which might be of interest to you regarding Professor Bezemek origins and experience and so on and so forth. So thank you once again, Christoph. This was a wonderful start of the afternoon, and I'm very happy for the discussion, especially because that's always the test of a good lecture. So thank you once again. Thank you for coming, and thank you for giving us this lecture.
Thank you so much for having me. It has been my distinct pleasure. Thank you.